When we read Mauryan history from our history books, we get this impression that whatever we are reading has actually happened. Now, these history books does not emphasize on the fact that whatever we are reading about Mauryan history is based on speculation, and these speculation are not as substantive as we would like it to be. So in this video, I will argue that in Mauryan history there exist huge gaps, and the sources which we use for Mauryan history has also some major problems. So when we talk about the sources, one of the most important sources which historians use to reconstruct the Mauryan history are the Pali chronicles. So these are the Sri Lankan chronicles that were written in Pali. And of these chronicles, two texts are most important for us. These are Mahavams and Deepavams. Now Deepavams is the older text, and most scholars believe that this was composed between 3rd century BC to 4th century AD. And Mahavams was composed around 5th century AD. So these are the two major Pali chronicles that historians use to construct the Mauryan history. Then we have the Divyavdan. Now Divyavdan is important because one of the important section of Divyavdan is Ashokavdan. Now Ashokavdan is the text from where we get most of our information about the life of King Ashok. Now the problem with these sources is that, first of all, these sources are not contemporary sources. So these sources were composed centuries after the Mauryan Empire. So this is one problem. The second problem is the fact that these sources tell us the orthodox Buddhist view of the Mauryan Empire. So it is quite impossible for historians to tell whether what is being written in these sources is actually the Mauryan history, or it is just how the Buddhist, particularly the orthodox Buddhist, saw the Mauryan history. So there is this dichotomy which historians have to face. The third problem with these sources is that sometimes we find that there are also mythical elements that are present in these sources. So for historians, it is quite tough to say whether the event that is described in these sources actually happened in the Mauryan period or it is a later addition. Then we find that there are also some inconsistencies in the Buddhist tradition as well. So when we read about Mauryan history, particularly Ashokan history, we get this information that Ashok ascended the Mauryan throne some 218 years after the Parinibbana of Lord Buddha. So for us to find out when Ashok became the Mauryan emperor, we have to see when the Parinibbana of Buddha happened. So when we read Buddhist sources, we get three dates. So the first date is 544 BC, the second is 486 BC, and the third is 483 BC. So you can see this inconsistency within the Buddhist tradition as well. Now the date which you choose for Buddha's Parinibbana will decide the date of Ashoka's accession as well. Now historians generally ignore the date of 544 BC for Buddha's Parinibbana. Even then we have two dates left. So that is how we can say that, even the date of Ashoka's accession is a matter of debate. So these are the problems that are associated with Sri Lankan chronicles. Now coming to the second source which historians use for the Mauryan history is Kautilya's Arthashastra. Now the problem with Kautilya's Arthashastra is that some scholars argue that Kautilya belonged to a later period and Arthashastra is also of a later period. It should not be used as a source for Mauryan history. Now even if we ignore this argument, the point still remains that Kautilya wrote his Arthashastra as a guide for future rulers. That is why we say that Arthashastra is a prescriptive text. It tells us how a kingdom should be governed. It does not provide us the descriptive detail of how the Mauryan Empire was governed. So this difference between a prescriptive text and a descriptive text should be kept in mind. So whenever we are reading Kautilya's Arthashastra, we should always keep in mind that this text does not describe us the detail of Mauryan Empire. This text tell us how Kautilya thought an empire should be governed. So this is an important point which we should keep in mind. Now there is a possibility that the Mauryan Empire functioned just like Kautilya tells us in his Arthashastra an empire should function. But what we see is that we have no way to prove this was the case. So this is the problem which historians face when they use Kautilya's Arthashastra as a model for the administration of the Mauryan Empire. Now the third important source which historians use for Mauryan history are the Ashokan edicts. And one of the most important thing which we should keep in mind when we study these edicts is that these edicts does not tell us about the day-to-day functioning of the Mauryan Empire. Instead, these sources tell us about how Ashoka thought that his subjects should live their life. Now, what was the reason behind this edict and why Ashoka thought that these edicts should be inscribed on major rocks or pillars is not known. There are different theories. So some scholars believe that Ashok wanted to promote Buddhist religion. Some say that Ashok wanted to promote a new moral order, or some believe that this was a tool of Ashok to consolidate his empire. Now, whatever the case may be, the point remains is that these sources does not tell us about the Mauryan history. It tells us about how Ashok thought that his subject should live his life. So when we use these sources for the Mauryan history, this should be kept in mind. Another source which historians use for Mauryan history is Megasthenesis Indica. Now we all know that Megasthenes was an ambassador of Seleucus Nicator who came to the court of Chandragupta Maurya. And whatever he saw of India, he wrote it in Indica. Now, one problem with this text is that we do not have the complete text. We have only paraphrase of particular segments of Indica in the works of later scholars. So this should be kept in mind that Indica, which we presently have, is not complete. We have only some fragments. Another important point about Megasthenesis Indica, which some scholars have argued, is that the way Megasthenes describes Mauryan administration should not be viewed as administration of the entire empire. Now, some scholars argue that this type of administration was mainly restricted to the region of Patliputra or to the region of Magad. It was in no way applicable to the whole Mauryan Empire. Another important point about Megasthenesis Indica is that sometimes we find that Megasthenes is factually wrong. So one example of this would be that Megasthenes tells us that the Indian society is divided into 7 classes. Now, how this conclusion was derived by Megasthenes is not known. But what is clear is that he is clearly wrong in this aspect. And this is quite important because some scholars argue that this inaccuracy of Megasthenes was due to the fact that he did not know any Indian language. So whatever he saw, he wrote without analyzing or without cross-checking it with Indians. So this is the problem with Megasthenesis Indica, which some scholars use as a source for Mauryan history. Now, if we look at the Mauryan history broadly, we will find that there are still many gaps that are yet to be filled. And one of the most important example of this would be the later Mauryans or the Mauryans who came after Ashok. First of all, we do not know when Ashok died, and how the Mauryan Empire declined is still a matter of debate. Now, if you want to know about the different theories which historians have put forward to describe the chronologies of Mauryan rulers who came after Ashok, you can watch these 2 videos. In these videos, you will find that how confused we are when we talk about the later Mauryans or the Mauryan rulers who came after Ashok. Thank you for watching.